Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is James. I'm the creator of the role-playing game Raven of the Scythe, which you can download at drivethroughrpg.com. And today we are going to be talking about magic, specifically low magic. So, I have described magic in Raven of the Scythe as low magic before, or rather, like, it's a low magic game or whatever, like differentiating it from high magic. And the reason I did that, the reason I put so much emphasis on the type and amount of magic that's available in the Raven of the Scythe game, is because that, from what I've found, nothing really quite defines a setting quite as much as the amount and kind of magic that exists within whatever universe you're talking about. To give you just a couple of examples, so like Dungeons and Dragons is pretty much the quintessential high magic sort of fantasy. Like you have flying castles and like wizards capable of like calling down meteor storms, and even like magic has even permeated the mundane in a lot of the settings like Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Dragonlance. You know, you have magic forges making weapons, or you know, you have magical automated farming implements and stuff, like helping the average person, you know, just plow in their field or whatever. Maybe they got a magic plow that plows on its own. I don't know that much about plowing. But, like, what I'm saying is that in a world like this, magic is certainly fantastic because of what it can do, you know? Like, teleporting all over the place, stopping time, levitating entire castles, creating, you know, armies of magically animated objects or golems or just a ton of things like that. So in that sense, yes, the magic is very fantastic, but it is so common that it's no longer, let's see, what would be the right word here? Wondrous, I guess. Like, if you saw a flying castle, you'd be like, wow, that is a lot of magic being used to hold that thing up. But you probably wouldn't, like, just freak out over it, thinking, like, oh my god, like, how is that thing even flying? Is that magic? Like, you know, you're going to know immediately that it's magic. And even if you don't know the specifics of what spell or even what type of magic was used to do it, you can kind of piece it together. Like, magic is something that, you know, you've probably heard of. You've definitely seen evidence of it. In the setting Eberron, I think they kind of took that to its logical conclusion, and they made the magic more like industrial type. So you have things like magic trains and like almost magical factories and things like that. So I think that's probably the most logical depiction of a world with that much magic running around. But it does sort of remove it from what you typically think of as fantasy, which is, you know, it's medieval European looking with, you know, some fantastical elements sprinkled in here and there. I think logically that if magic was that common, what you would see would not look anything at all like what we think of as medieval history. I think that magic would be well enough known and understood that the feudal society model would fall apart very quickly under a magical sort of, with magical influences being available. Things like castles would look much different if you have a world where things like flying are commonplace, where you have to worry about teleportation and stuff like that. Like all of the things that we associate with, medieval fantasy or whatever, like the castles and, even down to like troop formations and stuff like that. You're not necessarily going to want to utilize shield walls if things like mass, like, area of effect damaging spells are all that common. So that's one type of magic setting, like that's your high magic setting, and that's kind of why I think that falls apart if you start looking at it more thoroughly. I think that's why a high magic setting is going to end up looking more like Eberron than, say, Forgotten Realms. But then you have other types of magic systems that work in, like Middle-earth. In Middle-earth, magic is subtle. And yeah, it permeates just about everything, but it's not something that can be easily studied or understood. I used to play a lot of the pen and paper game by Decipher, their Lord of the Rings version of the game. And yeah, that game had some issues, and apparently there were a lot of issues going on with that company at the time, but it was still an alright system, and I think they really did a good job of capturing the nature of Tolkien-style magic. So, they had to take a few liberties with it just because in canon Tolkienism, there are only the 5 wizards, and they're not wizards because they learned how to do magic. They are wizards because they were made as wizards by the higher powers in Middle-earth. But whenever they do perform feats of magic, it has a certain type of flavor to it that sets it apart from more higher magic settings, which is the reason, like, I think it's a joke that went around back a long time ago, saying that Gandalf was actually just a 5th level wizard in Dungeons and Dragons. So that's another type of magic. I don't even want to say system, but like that's another world that's affected by magic, and the nature of the magic flavors the world. And then finally, if you want to look at something like the Cthulhu mythos, or really anything written by, H.P. Lovecraft or any of those guys back in, like, when they were writing, and the style of magic they imagined, in their world, magic was, just by its very nature, a frightening and dangerous thing to get into. Like, magic wasn't... It went beyond just being able to cast spells to throw a fireball or make a magical doorway appear or something like that. Like, Lovecraftian magic brings with it, like, this risk and this inherent cost that's, like, built into the way magic works. And even when magic does work, it's somewhat uncontrollable. And so because magic works that way, if you imagined a fantasy world built on Lovecraftian magic rather than D&D style magic, that world's going to look so different than what you would play in, like, typical D&D or any other, like, high fantasies type game. That's a world that would probably border more on horror. And all of this is done just because of the nature of the magic. Like, we're not changing anything else. Like, we're not even talking about time periods. We're just talking about how the presence of magic and the form that magic takes affects the world. So whenever I designed Raven of the Scythe, I tried to be super extra careful about how I presented magic, because I knew I wanted to make a game where you could have wizards that did fun wizard stuff, like, tossing around fireballs and, like, teleporting and stuff like that. Like, that stuff is fun, and I wanted a game that people could play and have fun with, but I didn't want to create a system of magic that broke the rest of the setting. Like, I didn't want magic to be the dominant storytelling force in the world. So the challenge with that was I wanted to make a system of magic that was fun. Like, it still gave spellcasting characters quite a few options and abilities with things, but nothing so intense that you suddenly have to rethink how the rest of the world works. And, the reason I say things like that is because, okay, let's take a spell, Meteor Shower. Let's say that you have a spell called Meteor Shower or whatever, and with it you literally call down a swarm of meteors and they just smash up something in front of you. Well, in an actual living and breathing world with real people in it, the mere presence of that spell drastically changes the entire world on a global political style. Like, because even if only a small number of people know how to cast it, suddenly everyone who has enough money and resources to build castles and raise armies are going to want to know exactly who knows how to cast this spell and either eliminate them entirely or bring them over and ensure somehow that they only work for them. Like, because if you have just a random person that can call down that kind of firepower, you're simply not going to be able to just let them walk around town, like playing chess at the tavern and like buying herbs at the shop. Like, that's not a situation that anyone in power would want to be in. And honestly, probably for some pretty good reasons. Like, I don't know if I would want to live in a town knowing that literally any one of my neighbors might be able to wipe out existence as I knew it. Like, that's just not a chance that I would necessarily be willing to take. But that's the situation that you get into when you start thinking about very high magic spells. So, with all that said, how then did I make the magic in Raven of the Scythe still let wizards do fun stuff, but not break the fabric of the world? And this was a super delicate balancing act, but I think I did it in a couple of very key ways. First and foremost is because the system of the game doesn't have expanding hit points or anything like that. Your hit points are going to stay around 20-ish throughout your character's entire career, for the most part, like, with all, aware that, of course, there are exceptions to that. But for the most part, around 20 is the amount of hit points that a normal character is going to have. So what that means is that no matter what, quote-unquote level your spellcaster is, they can still be taken down by an archer who's got a good bow and can make the shot. Like, that archer can potentially take the wizard down from a good safe distance. And if one archer can't do it, get 5 archers. Eventually, they can bring the guy down. And that brings me to another aspect, was I tended to make the ranges on the spells incredibly short. Some of the most direct damaging spells in the game have a range of 10 yards. There are ways you can increase that, so let's say at a maximum of 20 yards. That is the maximum range of the maximum spell after it's been doubled due to some of the options that are available in the game. A wizard is a threat at about 20 yards. That's certainly enough to make them a very dangerous threat, but that's not so much that they can hurt you from anywhere on the planet or something like that. Like, a wizard's going to have to get at least relatively close to someone in order to hurt them with magic. Now, on a battlefield, like if you're doing a regular, like, encounter style situation where, the bandits show up and the heroes are on one side of the road and the bandits are on the other side of the road and they have to fight over a distance of a few yards. Yeah, being able to deal damage at that kind of range is a huge advantage, especially against people, using melee weapons who have to get right up on you to attack. So in that sense, like on an encounter tactical scale, those type spells are still very, very useful. It's like, wow, look at the range on that thing. But it's not something that's going to literally cause every military strategist in the entire world to rethink the foundations of how are troops moved, how are walls built, like how should castles be constructed to protect the people living inside of it. And that even that is a pretty long distance spell for this game. Most spells have a range that maxes out at about 5 yards. So another way that I tried to limit the effect magic could have on the world was through the durations of the spells. With some finagling within the system, it's possible to get spells that last around 10 rounds of combat, and then they go away. So what you don't end up with is a situation where the spellcaster casts a spell, say, on him or herself or on one of their companions, and then hangs out with that spell active for the whole day or something like that. The spell durations allows the spellcasters to cast their spells, do a thing, and then try to do something else. So, and once again, that's with a little bit of finagling. Most spells last around 5 rounds. So, the point for that was, if you need to, say, cast an invisibility spell to get past some guards or something like that, yes, that's a perfect use of magic within Raven of the Scythe, and I think that's completely valid. It's fun, it's thematic, but then once you get past those guards, the spell wears off, and you need to think of something else to do. It's not like you can just turn yourself invisible, walk past the guards, walk down to the vault, and then take whatever you need to take while you're invisible, and then walk out and wait another couple of hours before the spell wears off. And the reason I did that was because, once again, like, if you have spells that last all day or, like, even for an hour or so, suddenly, like, okay, let's just use invisibility as an example. Like, if you have a location that you want to secure from people turning themselves invisible, then now you need to have some system in place to either detect invisible creatures when they try to come in, or something that dispels magic, or you need to find a way of getting guardians for whatever location this is who can see invisibility or see through invisibility, stuff like that. And it becomes sort of a magical arms race, and that's not what I wanted. I didn't want it to just be kind of a paper, rock, scissors of like, okay, we can't go in there invisible because they have an anti-invisibility ward up, but we can teleport in there because they don't have a teleporting shield. Stuff like that. Like, and the last thing that I did to try to, like, limit the effect that magic could have on the world was through the use of mana. So, in Raven of the Scythe, mana is the energy that spellcasters use to cast the vast majority of their spells. Mana is spent whenever the spell is cast. It's returned when the spellcaster rests. And that's pretty much the long and short of it. It's just a basic mana point system for spellcasting. But intentionally, the amount of mana that spellcasters have tends to be rather low, which means even though spellcasters can cause all sorts of magical havoc over a short period of time, they can't sustain that very long before they run out of mana. And the reason for that was I just wanted it to be an interesting choice for the spellcaster. Every time they cast a spell, they are considering, is this the best time to expend this resource? And of course, the amount of mana you can have does increase as your character becomes more powerful. And also, if you are out of mana, it's not like you suddenly lose the ability to cast spells entirely, but now, instead of using your mana points, you have to spend hit points to pay the mana cost of the spells, and that gets very painful very quickly, literally. So then it becomes an even tougher choice of, do I want to expend this resource now and bring myself closer to death to cause this effect? And yeah, that's how I did that. I felt like I did all right with the magic system in this game. Like, magic is hard to write for like game design purposes because you spend every other aspect of the game establishing what the rules for reality within this system are, and then you have to make a magic system which breaks those rules. So I tried to be very, very mindful of the effects that each spell would have on the world. Now, I'm not gonna lie, like, I am certain if someone was extraordinarily clever and went through the spell list available for all the wizards, that they would find something that I didn't think of, and they could be like, aha, this spell is the reality-breaking spell that would completely destroy the world as we know it if it was turned loose to the general public. Probably. But at least I didn't think of it, and that makes me happy. Another thing that I did was just sort of like miscellaneous stuff. Most spells have a casting time of an extended action, so you can't move and cast spells at the same time. So if you want to cast a spell, most of the time, that's the only thing you're going to be doing that round. Since magic is so limited, I try to include other options for spellcasters so that they didn't feel like they were left out. Like, I didn't want anyone to feel disappointed that they decided to play a wizard in Raven of the Scythe. And so I did that through a couple of different means. The first is the use of, it's a mechanic I use in the game. I call it invocations. And basically they are just extraordinarily minor little magical effects that, for the most part, I think there's one exception, but they can be cast without mana. It doesn't cost you anything in the world to cast them. You just can't be exhausted. And they can be cast as a fast action. So you can actually use these multiple times per round if you want, because you get to make 2 fast actions per turn. And I think there's like 5 or 7 of them in the game total, and every wizard picks 3 of them starting out. And they allow the wizards to do things like, there's one that lets them call small objects to their hand. There's one that lets them start fires. There's one that they actually get to make a telekinetic attack against a nearby enemy. Like, it's stuff like that that even if a wizard is out of mana, I wanted them to feel like they could do something. And also, it's so wizards aren't completely defenseless without their spells. Because even, like, if a wizard completely burns themselves out of mana and they're almost down to no hit points, that's a bad, desperate feeling for a player, in my experience, if you don't have anything else you can do. So the inclusion of the invocations was a way to sort of take that. It's a type of stress, but I don't think it's a good type of stress. I think it's more of like, just sort of throw your hands up and be like, well, there's nothing I can do. I think in games like this, feeling like you don't have anything you can do is a very bad feeling. So knowing that I was making a magic system as restrictive as I was, I tried to use these as a way to keep wizards from feeling like that. Another thing that I did with the magic system in this game is that it's actually pretty segmented into the various schools. And so, especially starting out, you're only going to have access to schools from one particular spell list. And with that, I wanted to kind of curtail the tendency that people have to, quote unquote, just pick the best spells off of each list. So, for instance, let's say you really want to be an abjurer, which is a type of wizard that focuses on protective magic in Raven of the Scythe. You really want to be an abjurer because you want to learn how to heal. So you make your character and you begin with the School of Abjuration. But now that you've done that, you don't have as easy of access to some of the other schools. Like, you can't necessarily take Siphon Life from the Necromancy School or Entangling Vines from Enchantment or anything like that. I mean, you can later on, of course, but starting out, and the reason I made it like that was because I wanted your characters to have flavor. Like, I didn't want every single wizard in the game to feel the same. And also, maybe you took Abjuration because you were interested in healing, but while you're in here, you start looking at the protective spells that it offers, and so now you have a choice. Do I want to stay here and learn healing and protective magic? Or do I want to, with some difficulty, branch out and start learning spells from another school of magic? So, in addition to the world building, like setting balance of what role I wanted magic to play, there was also the issue of how I wanted magic to feel for the people running these characters. And all in all, I have to say that I'm very happy with the way magic in Raven of the Scythe has turned out. It's, in my opinion, a fun system that gives you a lot of options, but it's not something that is so available that every single character is going to want to dip into it. Like, it takes effort and time, and in this game that's represented in your experience points. It takes a commitment to magic before you get to the really cool stuff, and then once you do, it becomes exponentially more useful the more you start learning how to combine your spells for different effects, or just the different spells that you learn, which gives you more options in more situations. So that's about my thoughts on magic and how it works in Raven of the Scythe. If you've got any thoughts or anything at all about magic, anything that you'd like to know about how magic works in Raven of the Scythe, or a specific spell or anything like that, or basically anything at all related to Raven of the Scythe, game design, world building, fantasy, anything at all really, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.